Hey there, and welcome to Leading Change Conversations, the podcast where we tackle real-life challenges with leaders like you to make organizational change a breeze. In this episode, we'll talk about aligning multicultural teams for success. Leaders often tell me they find a multicultural environment more challenging, but I think that diverse backgrounds can actually strengthen company culture and fuel innovation. So tune in to learn how to leverage the power of multicultural teams to drive change. I am your host. I'm Ulrike and I train, coach, and inspire leaders to turn into successful change agents, to communicate with impact, and to lead with authenticity. And today I have an amazing guest, Peter Murphy. So Peter Murphy-Lewis is the CEO of Strategic Pete and Head of Growth at WebStreet. With a strong background in digital marketing and business development, Peter loves creating innovative strategies that drive growth and engagement. He's passionate about using technology and data to transform businesses and build genuine connections. Welcome, Peter.
I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, great. So, we'll speak about multicultural teams. And as I said in the introduction, many leaders think it's just an additional hurdle, something that makes their life more complicated. What is your take on that?
Ooh, I would say, to come off a little hot, I don't have really strong opinions about things that don't matter. I'm kind of the person who asks a lot of questions in the room when we're having friends over or we're at work. I'm more of the question person, but I have a very strong opinion that multicultural teams are stronger and more creative. I would say equally efficient as those that are not multicultural. And I can't imagine building my team without that intention. Every team that I built since the first company that I created when I was 27 to teams that I've built for other CEOs as a fractional CMO, I try to find that diversity in cultural because I think that it's a unique way to solve problems.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this way of solving problems comes from the fact that people have very different backgrounds in terms of education, upbringing, different values, obviously, as well? If you come from very different cultures, you might have very different values. Is this something that you can leverage actively then, or is it something that just flows in without being really noticed?
I think it can be organic and it can flow, but I think you can add a catalyst to it and make it even stronger. As someone who my native language is English, I was raised in the United States. I moved to South America for my master's and PhD when I was 24 years old and lived 15 years there. I'll explain it to someone who doesn't necessarily speak a second language strongly or doesn't work in a multicultural background. So I always say that speaking with people from a different language is like having a different paradigm in life. And for someone who doesn't speak a second language, I say, oh, have you ever been around someone who's from a different culture? Have you ever been on a cruise ship with an Italian or a German or an Australian? Don't they just approach their kids differently, or the way that they talk about vacation, or the way that they look at their cell phone? And someone starts to understand that. And I said, I'll give you something that you'll definitely understand. Imagine that you're an attorney. Could you imagine thinking anywhere differently than from an engineer or a mathematician? And they start to understand that. So now I said, if you were going to solve a problem that wasn't specifically only math or wasn't only legal, wouldn't you want to have as many different people approaching that as possible? And that's where the way that I approach it. If I'm a marketer and usually work on teams that are trying to grow revenue. So it's a problem, right? It's the number one business development problem most people have. It's usually growth and revenue. So I want as many people who think as differently from me and from each other solving that problem.
Yeah, it's a famous out of the box thinking, I think, in a different way, because we hear it so often, we have to think out of the box. But then obviously staying in our box, also as a leader, is much more comfortable. That's the comfort zone. We know our own box very well, which means our level of ideas, to which degree we think of different solutions. We think that is the normal way of doing things. And then somebody from a very different culture comes in and suddenly comes up with an idea, which we often don't even understand. Do you think we need a mindset shift? Or is it a question of more communicating, better communicating, or more acceptance? What would you say, is an ingredient for successful multicultural collaboration?
So I think before answering the multicultural approach, I'm going to take your word, which is mind shift. And I think you predicted what I was going to say. And I think from a leader point of view, you mentioned that it might be that you might not feel comfortable, or it might be more comfortable to be in your own kind of approach or your own culture or your own framework. And I think that's where the mind shift comes in. I don't know at what point this happened for me, when it happens, and it happens for the great CEOs that I work with. But at some point you realize as a leader, what makes you uncomfortable is being comfortable. And I'll add some color and some adjectives to that. I find when I'm in a meeting and I'm the person telling people which way the boat is going or how we're going to solve a problem, and no one questions me, I feel uncomfortable. So I try to set myself up in an environment, and also set the CEOs up with whom I'm consulting, to think that they don't have the answer. Instead of telling people what the answer is and asking them to think differently than you, why don't you start differently and ask people to come up with proposals? And then you are the critical one, thinking about, what piece do I want to steal from Lena? What do I want to steal from Elijah? What part of the problem solving do I want to steal from Claudia? And then put that together. So it is a mind shift. And I think that it's not as hard as people think, right? Where I think it comes from is from fear. And fear of the unknown, and fear of the unknown translates to being out of your comfort box. And there's a exercise that Tim Ferriss did, I want to say 2014 or 2015, and you can find it on YouTube, and I believe it's a TED Talk, and it's called fear setting. And that fear setting exercise, I've done that as a workshop multiple times, as a public speaker in small group settings. I've even done it in Spanish. I've translated from English to Spanish. It works in other cultures. And I think the key there is, for a leader who's struggling with this question, or thinks that the conversation you and I are having right now is worth, engaging with or contemplating, go take the fear setting exercise and put yourself through it. What will happen? What's the worst thing that will happen if I consider building a multicultural team or approach to this problem? And you're going to realize you can set yourself up for parameters or guidelines so that the worst thing won't happen. And even if you failed, the best thing that will happen, you'll walk away learning from it, even if you don't solve the problem.
Yeah, interesting. What is a typical worst thing that people come up with in this exercise?
Well, usually I'm doing it with younger kids, 20 to 30 years old, sometimes executive MBA programs that I've done this with. And their fear is usually around judgment. It's around failure and being embarrassed. Whereas I think for a CEO, I think it's oftentimes, and it's not a perfect translation, but it's closer to power. So not being the smartest person in the room, not knowing the solution yourself, allowing somebody doesn't speak English as fluent as you, or isn't an engineer like you, or isn't an attorney like you, and maybe it's a virtual assistant who comes up with a simple solution. Sometimes that's embarrassing, and that embarrassing is closer to their ego, which is closer to power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I see it. And I also, what I think is that older leaders or more experienced leaders with like 20, 30 years of background, it depends obviously how they have managed their ego in these destinies. But in general, they start being a bit more relaxed with that. Yeah, good leaders at least, and react differently to that kind of let's say, threat or the fear they could have there, losing their status, losing their expert status, being, like you say, the best and most competent person in the room. And I think we have to let go of things to be able to really have a great multicultural collaboration happening. I like to use a metaphor when it comes to how people look at their tasks or their goals. And I compare it, with a destination on Google Maps, for example. And when you do not put in your point of departure into Google Maps, Google Maps will never be able to calculate a path to get there, right? Whereas in the business world, we have our targets, but we define them usually very concretely. But what we do not define very concretely is our point of departure. What is my attitude towards that, and so on. And this attitude or this point of departure is shaped by exactly that, by our beliefs, but also a lot by our personality style and our culture. And if we are not clear, that's my point of departure. And it's very different from the other people here in the room for various reasons, because they also have a different personality, but they also have a different cultural background. And so they look at it maybe from the opposite perspective. Or if I'm sitting, let's use the metaphor, on the west side, they might be on the north. And so they look at it from a different side. And that is super interesting, because I cannot force them to see it from my side at 100%. But I can try to see what they see from their side, because they might see a risk or opportunity that for me is literally from my position or from my upbringing. And I think many leaders are very success-driven too, or result-driven. But then they have a hard time to let go of control. That often goes hand in hand. I think they need to understand, hey, you can have your result even better if you let go of that control and you let the other perspectives coming in. And the mind shift for me is really in giving up the idea that the reality that we see is the one. And that there is not one reality for one project, for example. Everybody has a different one. And every different reality is as important or equal or valid as mine, or as true, actually. Because it's just a different point of view. And giving that idea up is hard, because people always fall back into what I see is the reality. I've analyzed it, I have looked at it in every single detail, so that is how it is. And I think this is where we then put up a real obstacle into this, letting diversity, the magic of diversity happen, because then we close that door by, saying that's how it is, because I see it like that. And I think that's interesting. How do you help people also to move away from that?
Ooh, so I love your example of the point of departure. I've never heard of that metaphor, and I'm gonna borrow it from you for the future. I think I want to start off with bad news. I think there's a certain amount of luck in, were you born into a certain family who makes you think this way, right? My guess is there's a strong stereotype. The average American is not born into a multicultural setting. We don't usually speak a second language. In my case, I'm from the middle of the US, from a small town of 2,000 people. The likelihood of people from my hometown having a passport is pretty slim, right? And those are common jokes that people they might not say it to my face, but my friends from other countries will now say it to my face. In my opinion, there's a sort of luck of being born into a family where ideally your mom and your dad, or if you don't have two parents, your grandmother and your father or your uncles, raise you to think this way. I'm fortunate that my parents did think this way. They weren't the smartest person in the room. And as my dad, who is a banker and grew a bank almost to $1 billion in assets, and grew it with his teammate with the CEO to 11 different branches. My dad didn't finish college. So he probably wasn't going to be the smartest person in the room. He might have the most emotional intelligence in the room. But that kind of framework that I was born into, I think, made it possible for me. Now, I definitely think it can be learned, right? Like my first company in South America, when I was 27 years old, the smartest people who started to join my company were French interns. So from the year of 2007, when I started the company, until I sold it in last year, there's probably 100 different French interns who came through my travel company and helped us grow to get in the New York Times. Paul McCartney, Beyonce, Aerosmith all purchased travel experiences from us. And the smartest person in the room were French. 22-year-olds who were teaching me how to run my company in South America. So, like I was blessed that I was born into a family, but the people who taught me along the way happened to be happenstance that, applied to become an intern. And then now I can't think any differently. Now, I think your challenge, and you probably do this for a living, and I don't necessarily do this for a living, but it's part of my work, is helping people who didn't have that luck learn how to think that way.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. I mean, obviously, speaking a second language or even a third one, or some people speak five. So it's like, wow, I speak three, but that's like average in my environment just. And I think it makes a difference. I also live in another language than my mother tongue, like you do, for example. And it makes a difference because you realize just that in other languages, there are different words for different things. There are sometimes much more words. Sometimes there is no word in another language than in your own, for example, because this thing or this state of mind just doesn't exist in this other language at all. And you wonder, how can they live without it? But they do. So it's quite interesting. Also, in some languages, how many words you have for love, for example, or how to describe a person with whom you are as a couple. And in some languages, you have very precise 3 or 4 different types of words, and they're all very precise to see how deep the relationship is. Whereas in some other language, you have only the word friend, and friend is friend, and partner is partner, but that's it, kind of. And it's very interesting, I think, because that is the different perspective that you can benefit from when you hear from people who actually speak really another language. And we had that luck to grow up in 2 different types of settings, maybe because they have parents from 2 different nationalities, which is an absolute, I think it's great, because if you grow up with 2 languages, I guess that your brain is working very differently too, because right from the start, it's working in 2 like parallel universes somehow. But what I also see often like a challenge, and people, I think that this is different, is everything that goes into the way of how we communicate, And I think the most difficult thing for people to evaluate, and like you said in the beginning, some have also the fear, to make a mistake, maybe to offend someone else. Sometimes you feel quite insecure, depending on what other culture is that, if we don't know it at all, how to communicate. And I think the biggest differences which we can see here, or distinctions, is between direct communication, a very direct way, which can be offensive in the ears of people who are coming from a culture where indirect communication is the norm. And the other way around, those who come from a direct communication culture, the indirect, they just don't get it. They don't even get that there's an underlying message or something behind that. And this is where I see that a lot of misunderstanding can happen. How do you tackle that? Is it something, because that's sometimes difficult, especially when you don't know well the people, when the trust is not established yet. You don't want to make these kind of mistakes, actually.
I feel like we might need 4 hours to unveil this conversation. But I'm glad you translated into communication. I guess before I answer the question directly, one of the things that popped up when you were, talking about that is going back to, if there's someone in your audience, who says, like, I'm from a small town in Germany, or a small town in France, or a small town in Kansas, like myself, this is irrelevant to me. I have no opportunity. I would say you have 3 opportunities, right? Like, generally speaking, at least in my experience, and this might not be politically correct, different sexes, different genders also think differently than me. So I surround myself by women because they think differently than me. The majority of people on my team are women. And secondly, I try to surround myself by people who are different age than I am. So there's really, my right-hand woman, she's probably 16 years younger than I. And then the second person that I go to for advice is my father, and he's 73 years old. So you don't have to think that, like, for this to be applicable, you need to be working with people that speak 100 different languages. And then also, you and I know that you can work with remote teams, right? So you could, if you want to find this diversity, you can go look for it. My right-hand woman is from Palestine, right? And I've never met her in my entire life, and we worked together for 5 years. And I bounce every hard idea off her. So, and I think that leads perfectly into your question around direct communication. Now, I would be interested in you pushing back on me, because I feel like you probably know this better than I. My sense is that A players no matter how indirect their cultural approach is to communication, like leaders who are direct. Now, that doesn't mean offensive. That doesn't mean being a jerk. That doesn't mean being an idiot, being an asshole. That doesn't mean man-explaining. But they like people to be direct because smart people, even if they're indirect, emotionally, they can pick up on information really quickly. And that in that direct communication that people pick up from my energy or my body language or the way that I talk about things, they still know it. So I have an amazing CEO who I worked with in a private equity turnaround about 4 years ago named Jason Long. And this brilliant leader told me, everybody knows what you're thinking. So the first thing you should say is what you're thinking and don't beat around the bush. And I think that, that matters if you are from Palestine, if you're from Kenya, if you're from Mexico, if you're from Chile, if you're from Kansas. Now, the way that you say that, the tone and the words that you use can be carefully crafted. So I'm a big player of being very, very direct. Now, where I would say that I'm making an exception is in my first month of onboarding a person who thinks differently than I, or their approach to communication or their cultural approach to communication is much more indirect than mine, is I save that strong, direct language for meetings where there's multiple people. And I use the strong language aimed at somebody who's already very comfortable with that style. And then I break the person into it. And what's key is, this going back to the very first thing you and I talked about is getting people comfortable to question me and not being the smartest person in the room. So if you and I work together, I'm your marketing manager and you're the CEO, the way that you would talk to me, because we've been working together for 9 months, is going to be very direct. Peter, this is subpar. I think you need to go back to working on a creative brief. Can you prepare a creative brief in the next 2 hours? I would like for it to be as great as the one that you did last month, and say the name. So you're complimenting the person, and then say, this was a D+. I know that you can get it to an A-. Can you bring it back to me before 1 p.m. Eastern? I know you can do this. That worked for you, right? And if there's 15 other people in the room, they hear that. And then 20 minutes later in the meeting, you say, hey, you know what, Peter, I gave you the wrong instructions on this project. I think you handled it the right way. I really appreciate that. I'm glad that when you couldn't get a hold of me, you made the right decision and you didn't follow what you thought I should do. Rather, you followed your gut. And, if some people listen to you and I have that direct conversation for 30 days, they're going to start really appreciating the way that you run the team. And they're going to feel comfortable because they know that when you're direct with them, later you're going to, scratch their back and sing praise to them. I wonder if you think differently.
Yeah, that's true. And I think it's important, like you said, to say it. Yeah, to say that to say also in the first place what you think and even how you are. I know a leader, for example, he's extremely direct, sometimes too direct. He's sometimes very, very strict with people as well. He really says when something goes wrong right away without taking any gloves or so. But on the other hand, he's also very, very open, he gives a lot of compliments, when things go right. He's very much recognizing the efforts of people at the same time. And those who work with him say, it's great because yes, if I miss out on something, I'm hearing it from him, yeah. But on the other side, I know he's really appreciating my work and my efforts. And it's completely okay then to hear from him this very direct criticism, because on the other hand, there's a lot of openness around, acknowledging everything that is good and all the efforts. And I know that when he is starting with a new team or taking over parts of new people from another team, for example, he immediately says exactly that. He says, hey, I'm a guy, very, very direct. That can be, in the first place, you might think this is really offensive, but I don't want to offend you. I'm just really honest. I want to be honest. I want you to be honest. I am honest too. Sometimes I might choose the wrong words. You can tell me that directly right into my face. No problem. I will not take it badly. But that's the way how I am. And I think it's important that people stand up more for maybe their personality style and their communication style, because it has to do obviously with their culture, but also with, how they are. Some people are just more introvert, more shy, will not speak up easily. And for them, it's much more difficult, obviously. And they admire often people who are very direct and outspoken and everything. Oh, it's so great to be like that.
I'd like to add in one tactical piece of advice that, I've learned from smart CEOs and smart people on my team, which is you need to be careful with the written word when you're being direct, with people who come from non-direct cultures. So if I'm going to give some type of feedback that might come off as critical, I do it with a video, not by Slack or email. So if I'm unable to meet with that person quickly, or it's just not efficient for me to have a 10-minute Slack huddle or a 10-minute Zoom call, I'll record a Loom or Hippo video, whatever brand, whatever tech tool you're using. And, I'm very aware that although I'm direct, my tone is encouraging and empowering. And when I write on Slack, my tone is not encouraging and empowering, especially if their first language is not English. So me sending you a short little video of recording my screen saying, hey, I really like the way that you approach this, starting off with a compliment, where I think you could do better because I saw your work last week. When they hear that tone, that's so much different than me writing, you did good job last week. I like your approach. I think that this could be a lot better. A non-direct person could walk around their house for the next 3 hours stressed about that Slack message.
Yeah. You bring up something really interesting, actually. When we communicate with others, we are programmed that we meet people physically. Yeah, we are not at all genetically, our brain is absolutely not ready for the digital world or for WhatsApp messages, even less, because we feel comfortable. That's why we like to have face-to-face meetings as well. Yeah, that's why we feel sometimes very uncomfortable with online meetings. We like to see the full package, the whole nonverbal cues, the whole set of it. The micro mimics in the face, which you have a hard time to see already on screen, but you see at least a little bit of it. And ideally, even the whole body and see everything and feel the energy in the room. That's the ideal, obviously. But like you say, if you have just a written text in whatever shape and form, be it an SMS or an email, people have to make up everything else. The tone, the energy that comes across, the facial expressions, they will make everything up. Depending on their own bias, depending on their own self-doubts, depending on, I don't know, the history they have with that person, or what happened maybe yesterday in a discussion. And the interpretation can be totally, totally wrong. It's a great example which you gave there. And I think especially when it comes to intercultural communication, it's super important that people get as many cues as possible. Means that they see as much and hear as much of us as possible. And I like the idea of sending a video message if you cannot have a live call, at least, instead of just sending the email, because it's such different. Nobody does that. I've never seen a leader actually sending a video message. And I think this was a great idea. People would be really surprised probably to get a video message. Most people in the corporate were like, what? Now he's sending video messages?
Yeah. Well, for anyone who hasn't done it, the easiest tool out there, and it's free, is Loom, loom.com, Loom. It's a great one. I have one other tactical thing going back to our previous conversation. Sorry if I'm derailing where you want to take the conversation. But I think sometimes for people who this conversation sounds interesting, but at the same time terrifying, giving people something actionable allows them to feel a little bit more relaxed and think about how they can approach it. One of the ways that I encourage, people, direct reports, to start to feel comfortable to question me and to critique me is through a daily survey. So the person who starts working with me, the first 30 days they work with me, before they close the computer, they fill out about a 5-question survey at the end of the day. And one of those questions is, what is one thing that we could have done to better onboard you in your first month here? And it says in parentheses, more one-on-one time, better, more written content, more videos, explaining who is whom, a better or work chart type of thing. And then we put in parentheses, if you fill out a bad answer, or if you fill out something that is not constructive criticism, we will reach out to you and ask for it, because you need to get comfortable questioning us. And in my opinion, this works for two things. One is it forces the person over 30 days to get in the habit of questioning that everything that's happening inside the team is not perfect, and that they have to say that out loud. And then secondly, as a manager, it lets you know who actually has tact to be able to constructively criticize the way that you're running the team. So if you send a message to me on day 17 saying, it would have been more helpful when Peter was talking about the quarterly goals, if he would have explained how they came up with these, what the baseline was, and what the point of departure was for how we're going to approach this. I felt like I was missing some context so that I can do my job. Fantastic, right? I know that I want you to speak up because the way that you asked me or you critiqued me is fantastic. If you would have put in your survey, Peter's explanation of Q4 goals was boring. It didn't make any sense to me. I can't imagine how we're going to ever make that. There's no way I'm going to invite you to speak in front of a group of 10 people to question me, right? Like, I need to coach you up, or you might not be a good cultural fit. So those two things kind of teach you. So if you don't want to start asking for people's critique or the way that they approach problems differently out loud, do it in a simple survey the first 30 days.
That's an interesting thing, yeah, because people hesitate, obviously. And I think what's very interesting with that is the learning of them to give honest feedback as well, because we shy away from that, especially in the beginning in a new role, especially. I mean, then we try to find out who is thinking what, the whole power game that is happening in this company and all of that. And we're very careful. It depends on the person, obviously. Some are not careful at all, but many are pretty careful in the beginning. And I think then we very quickly come into a way of acting that at the end we don't feel comfortable with, because it's not feeling very authentic and honest anymore, because we tried so much to fit into this new team that we forgot a bit ourselves in the first few weeks. And I think this is great, because you can stay true to yourself while being in a safe environment in a certain way, because this is still a safe way of doing it, especially if it's communicated like that and everybody does it like that. It's not just you, but everybody who is a new joiner has this process actually got to go through. I think it's a great tool, very nice tool for anyone who is onboarding teams, maybe something new to try out. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Peter. I mean, time was running like crazy. I think we could have probably discussed for another 2 hours easily. There's so much in this topic. So what I would like to really encourage people is to see the opportunity of a multicultural team, especially also when it comes to change. Change is always difficult to get through. People have a different view on change as well, depending on their multicultural or their cultural background. But according to that, you might be able to avoid some pitfalls. You might be able to overcome a certain resistance altogether because of these different perspectives, and to use it really like something positive. Is there anything last word, last advice you want to give to the audience, Peter?
The only thing I would say is get comfortable with change. Do it, outside of examples that matter. Go do the fear setting exercise by Tim Ferriss and put in there whatever the change is you think that, that wakes you up at 2:00 in the morning with a little bit of insomnia. Your body tells you that you need change. You need to make some type of decision inside of your company, but it stresses you out. Walk through the fear setting. It'll make you feel a little bit more comfortable with change.
I will do that too, by the way, and try that out. I think this is certainly a tool that helps a lot, to do things that we have not tried out before. So thanks, Peter, and thank you to the audience for tuning into Leading Change Conversations today. So if you want to improve your own skills on leading change or communicating more effectively, you can check out my courses for individuals on my website. I have quite a bunch of useful 90-minute courses there around overcoming procrastination, surmounting change resistance, communicating with impact, influencing through presence as well. So until next time, keep leading, keep learning, and making a difference.